and welcome. Please take a seat, get cosy, and enjoy a cup of terror with me, Stefanie Valentine. Hello, my spooky little pumpkins. Thank you for joining me today. A Cup of Terror is a series where I talk about true crime cases that have a dash of the strange, be that supernatural, or to do with the occult, or just something downright odd. Now, it's been a while. I know, if you watched one of my last convention videos, you would have seen that, unfortunately, the vid finally got me. So for the last few weeks I've been recovering from it and kind of getting over it. I've still got a little bit of a cough, so hopefully that doesn't interfere too much with the filming. Right, so today's video is another historical one, and it involves vampires. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the New England vampire panic. Now, I consider these to be true crime cases, as bodies and graves were desecrated and violated, so yeah, a crime definitely happened in my eyes. There's nuances to the situation though, as you will see. Tuberculosis, or TB, caused a health crisis throughout Europe and the United States in the 18th and 19th century. In the 19th century, TB killed about a quarter of the adult population of Europe. TB is a highly infectious disease caused by the Mycobacterium tuberculosis bacteria. By the late 19th century, 70 to 90% of the urban populations of Europe and North America were infected with the Mycobacterium tuberculosis bacteria, and about 80% of those individuals who developed active TB died of it. It was absolutely awful. TB was also known as consumption because the infected person suffered significant weight loss, withering away. It looked like they were being consumed, wasting away by this illness, and that would be how they appeared to their loved ones. It affected the lungs, and symptoms included a chronic cough, fatigue, fever, and coughing up white phlegm. Their skin would turn grey, their eyes would become sunken, and sometimes blood would trickle from the edges of their mouths. Unfortunately, people didn't understand much about the disease until the later part of the century. TB is very infectious and easily spread between people in close quarters, and when one member of the family caught it, it would quickly spread amongst the rest of the family. There was no cure for TB at the time, and treatment wasn't very effective. The advice was very typical of the 18th and 19th centuries. Some doctors would prescribe bleedings and purgings. Often people were just advised to rest, eat well, and exercise outdoors. Some unconventional 19th century cures included drinking brown sugar dissolved in water and frequent horse riding. Another early treatment was mesmerism or hypnotism. People were obviously very frightened and scared, and when people are scared, logic tends to go out the window. And this is how frenzied madness ended up spreading throughout the communities in New England, United States, in the 18th and 19th century. This panic was the result of the tuberculosis outbreak and the fact that nothing seemed to stop it. And the way that the communities reacted to this and the cures that they sought out were most likely spurred on by the spiritual traditions and folklore that had been brought over from Europe by the immigrants, particularly Eastern Europe and Germany, as people desperately tried to find an explanation for what was happening to them and their loved ones. The most famous example of this mass hysteria happened in the late 1800s in Exeter, Rhode Island. A farmer called George Brown sadly lost his wife, Mary Eliza, to TB on the 8th of December 1883. 6 months later, on the 6th of June 1884, his eldest daughter, 20-year-old Mary Olive, also ended up dying of the same illness. She had complained of fearful dreams and a crushing weight which drew the life out of her as she slept. She must have been a popular person, as it seems like the whole town turned out for her funeral. Several years later, 1889, and George and Mary's only son Edwin became seriously ill, and he became very thin and very weak, and it was shocking to see because Edwin was a strong, strapping young man. He also dreamt of being suffocated and also drowned. He relocated to Colorado Springs with his wife, hoping that the air and mineral waters would help him to recover. He did make some progress, and he did start to feel a bit better. Another of George's daughters, Mercy Lena Brown, she didn't fall ill until nearly a decade after her mother and sister died. She was still a child when they passed away. It's thought that Lena was infected at the time, but remained asymptomatic for years. She unfortunately grew sick very quickly after showing the first signs of the disease, and she died on the 17th of January, 1892, when she was just 19 years old. By the way, Mercy was her given name, but her family called her Lena, and in her obituary she is named Miss Lena, so I will continue referring to her as that throughout this video, just in case you're confused as to who I'm talking about. Edwin returned home when he heard of his sister's death. Unfortunately, this move wasn't good. It made him worse, and his health quickly declined once more. His fevered dreams returned, and he would often shout out that, "She was here, she wants me to come with her, she haunts me." Poor George was in a state of despair. He'd lost his wife, his 2 daughters, and his son was really ill. As I said, medical knowledge about TB was virtually non-existent. It wasn't known what caused the disease or how it spread. Doctors weren't able to explain why, one by one, the Brown family were all catching the disease and dying from it. Friends and family thought they knew what caused it, though, and they soon told George of an old folks' tale that was a widely held belief in New England and Europe at the time. The superstition claims that, quote, by some unexplained and unreasonable way in some part of the deceased relative's body, live flesh and blood might be found, which is supposed to feed on the living who are in feeble health. So basically, the reason that people died from consumption was due to one of the deceased persons taking the life force from their living relative. What does that sound like to you? A vampire. In Rhode Island at that time, and many other states such as Vermont, Eastern Connecticut, Southern Massachusetts, the belief and fear of vampires was really widespread, and the communities were gripped by a vampire hysteria. It was known as the New England Vampire Panic. Now, it's unlikely that the locals and the townsfolk themselves would have used the term vampire, as that word wasn't really used much in the community at that time. But the newspapers and outsiders would have used that term due to the similarity with vampire beliefs in Eastern Europe. So to stop these vampires from attacking and killing the local population, examinations and rituals would be performed. This involved the bodies being dug up and examined. If the corpse seemed unusually fresh, and if the heart and other organs contained blood that was still liquid and seemed fresh, then that corpse would be seen to be feeding on the living, taking their life force, and that was the reason why that person was falling ill. If that happened, there were a couple of ways in which the locals could stop further attacks. One method, which was definitely the nicest and most respectful, would be to turn the body over in its grave, so turn it face down. Another method, which was not as nice, it involved a ritual burning of the dead person's internal organs, and then they would rebury the body. Sometimes the corpse would be decapitated, but that wasn't the end of the ritual. If there were any family members who were suffering with TB, they would also breathe in the smoke from the burned organs, or they would even eat the ashes, hoping that this would cure them. Eek. I don't think I would like to do that. No, thank you. Apparently, George Brown didn't really believe this superstition. However, he was soon persuaded by fearful townsfolk to give permission to exhume the bodies of his wife and his daughters. On the morning of the 17th of March, 1892, in the Chestnut Hill Cemetery, villagers, along with a local doctor and a newspaper reporter, dug up the bodies and they were examined under the direction of Dr. Harold Metcalf. First, they dug up and then examined the bodies of George's wife and his eldest daughter, and they found the expected level of decomposition, nothing unusual there. However, when they opened up the casket of his younger daughter, they were shocked. The body of Lena Brown was found on its side, and she looked remarkably fresh. She didn't look like she was decaying at all. Her face appeared flush. Blood was found in Lena's heart, and this pretty much confirmed that poor Lena was some kind of vampire who was going around sucking the life from her living relatives, and she was the reason that Edwin was ill. Looking back with all the medical knowledge that we have now, we know that Lena's body, that was, pretty normal. She'd only died a couple or so months before, so not a long amount of time really. And accounts differ a bit. Some say that Lena's body had already been buried and therefore they exhumed it from the cold ground. Others say that she rested in a crypt until the icy ground thawed enough for the undertakers to dig a grave. Nevertheless, she had died in the winter months and it had been very cold, so the cold would have helped preserve her body and slow down any decaying that would have happened. Dr. Harold Metcalf, who really didn't want anything to do with it, he tried explaining to the locals that this looked completely normal. The rate of decomposition was in keeping with the fact that she had been dead for only 2 months, but the locals were having none of it. They wouldn't have been educated to the same level that the doctor was, and they wouldn't really have been able to understand what he was trying to explain to them, and they probably didn't want to understand. Tuberculosis, it had gripped the community, and they just wanted an explanation for what happened, and they were more likely to believe the local folklore and the superstitions than they were medical science. After all, the doctors and science were doing sod all to stop the spread, and nothing that the doctors were saying seemed to be helping. So the locals cut out Lena's heart and liver and burned them before they reburied her. The ashes of her burnt organs was then mixed with water and fed to Edwin in hopes that it would stop the disease. This obviously didn't work, and sadly Edwin died 2 months later on the 2nd of May 1892, aged 24. If that's not awful enough, the poor family would continue to suffer even more tragedy. TB would continue to take George Brown's children until there was only 1 out of 7 left. Annie Elora Brown died on the 9th of August 1895, aged 25. Jenny Adeline Brown died on the 2nd of October 1895, aged 18. Myra Frances Brown died on the 25th of June 1899, aged 18. only Hattie Mae Brown, George and Mary's fifth child, born in 1875, ended up surviving. She got married twice, she had children, and she lived until 1954, where she died at the age of 79. George Brown also ended up living a long life, passing away on the 17th of November 1922 at the age of 80. I mean, how terrible for him to have lost almost his entire family. It's really, really sad. And I hope he managed to find some sort of peace throughout his life. Unfortunately, what happened to Lena was not a one-off incident. In fact, many, many instances of this ritual being performed were recorded throughout the 18th and 19th century. In fact, Lena Brown was the last recorded case of suspected vampirism in the US. As I was looking into this case, I found all these other accounts, and they were so fascinating that I thought I would tell you about some of the other unfortunate people who fell victim to this vampire panic. The first documented case occurred in Manchester, Vermont. Rachel Harris married Captain Isaac Burton on the 8th of March 1789. Unfortunately, the marriage didn't last long, as soon after their wedding, she became seriously ill and less than a year later died from tuberculosis on the 1st of February 1790. The year after, on the 4th of January 1791, her widower, Captain Isaac Burton, married her stepsister, Huldah. Huldah was a very healthy woman, but she too ended up falling ill soon after they were married. Her symptoms and circumstances were very similar to Rachel's, so the family deduced that Rachel was the cause of the illness, even though she had been dead for a couple of years. In February 1793, more than 500 of the locals watched Rachel's body be exhumed and her heart, liver and lungs were removed. The organs were then burned to ashes on the blacksmith's forge. There are some that say that some of the organs were kept to make medicine for Huldah. Regardless of whether she consumed any of the ashes or not, Huldah died later that year on the 6th of September 1793. Allegedly, the people of Manchester decided that, you know what, Rachel really wasn't a vampire after all. However, they did think she was actually a witch instead. Poor Rachel. Next is Abigail Staples in Cumberland, Rhode Island. She was born on the 26th of January 1773. Her exact date of death seems to be unknown. We do know that it was either 1795 or 1796. Anyway, not long after the death of Abigail, her sister Lavinia Chase fell ill with TB too. As she became weaker and paler with each day, she started suffering with fevered dreams, feeling smothered and suffocated by a shadowy figure which sat upon her chest, crushing her with its weight. During one of those dreams, she would suddenly sit bolt upright and yell Abigail's name before falling back to sleep. Lavinia's husband, Stephen Chase, was very unnerved by all of this, and he spoke with her father, Stephen Staples. After talking for a while, they came to the conclusion that an evil spirit was responsible, and Abigail could be that evil spirit, draining the life force from Lavinia. Instead of just going ahead and digging up Abigail's body, the two men decided to get permission from the town council. So that was very polite of them, doing it the proper way. In February 1796, the Cumberland Town Council granted permission for Stephen Staples to exhume the body of his daughter. The council was actually quite reluctant to grant permission. They didn't quite believe the two men's story, but they thought, kind of for peace of mind of the community, they would allow it. What happens next is somewhat of a mystery. No records exist regarding Abigail's condition when her grave was open. No family accounts were recorded, so we have no clue what happened. And we don't know what happened to Lavinia. Like I said, a complete mystery. We don't know where Lavinia was buried, but Abigail is buried in an unmarked grave at Rhode Island Historical Cemetery. There was a family in Dummerston, Vermont, in the 1790s. There was a man called Leonard Spaulding. His title is Lieutenant Leonard Spaulding in the town records, but on the gravestones of his children, the inscription is Captain Leonard Spaulding. I'm not sure which title is correct. He seems to be mostly known as Lieutenant Leonard Spaulding, so I shall refer to him as that. Now, sadly, Lieutenant Spaulding had lost 6 of his 11 adult children to consumption, and he was getting desperate. Yet another daughter of his, Olive, grew ill, and the lieutenant turned to folklore in hopes of a cure. There was also another superstition at that time which said that vines or roots would grow between buried caskets, and when the vine or the root had reached the coffin of the last one buried, another family member would die. The only way to stop this effect was to break the vine and then take the body of the last one buried and burn the vital organs. So his son Josiah, his body was dug up and his vital organs removed and burned. Olive ended up surviving, and she went on to live a long, healthy life. So, was this ritual the reason that Olive survived? Or is it just more likely that she was just one of the lucky few who made it? I should note that this account was published in the late 1800s, so about 100 years after the event actually happened, and most likely won't be 100% accurate, but it does give us a record of the old folks' tale of a creeping vine that causes death. Next, we have Sarah Tillingcast. Sarah was the daughter of an Exeter farmer named Stukely Tillingcast, and she was one of 14 children that the farmer had. 14 children, oh my goodness. Anyway, Stukely is said to have had a dream where all of the trees in his orchard started to wither and die, and shortly after, Sarah became ill with tuberculosis and died in 1776. Not long after Sarah died, one of her sisters also grew ill, and she started telling everyone how she was seeing Sarah in her bedroom, sitting on various parts of her body in order to cause her pain. Unfortunately, this daughter passed away, quickly followed by 4 more of Stukely's children. So, 6 of their children had died. Suddenly, Stukely and his wife Honor, as well as one of their sons, all started having visions of Sarah. They told their neighbours what was happening, and they all decided that they should dig up all 6 of Stukely's dead children. They found the remains of the bodies to be in normal states of decay, except for Sarah. Sarah seemingly showed the fewest symptoms of decomposition, even though she was the first one to die. Her eyes were open, fresh blood was found in her heart, and it looked like her nails and her hair had grown in that time. This was all taken as proof that Sarah was the cause of the deaths in the family. Sarah's heart was removed from her body and burned on a rock, and the visions all supposedly stopped. Stukely's wife, Honor, had been ill, but she recovered, but unfortunately his son ended up dying, becoming the 7th and final victim. However, this account was published in an article in 1888. According to Michael E. Bell, a folklorist, there were a few inconsistencies between the article and the historical record. Sarah wasn't actually the eldest daughter. She actually died in 1799, not 1776, and 4 of the children died, not 7. Like with the Spalding family account, with the amount of time that had passed, it may not be too surprising that some of the details had changed. Plus, as we know from many of the historical records we've talked about before, people tend to exaggerate and change a few of the details. Sarah is buried at the Rhode Island Historical Cemetery, Exeter 14, in the Tillingcast family plot. In Foster, Rhode Island, Captain Levi Young and his wife Anna had a farm, along with their 8 children. They were doing pretty well for themselves, selling their vegetables and their jams. Their eldest daughter was Nancy, and she looked after the accounting and the bookkeeping for the farm. She was a smart young lady. Sadly, in 1827, at the age of 19, Nancy fell ill with tuberculosis. On the 6th of April 1827, Nancy passed away from the illness. Her sister Almira took over the bookkeeping duties for the farm. A few months after Nancy's death, Almira fell ill with a similar sickness, but it was slower acting. We obviously know that it was tuberculosis, unfortunately, but Levi called doctors to try and treat his daughter. Nothing worked. One morning, Levi found his daughter sat up in bed one morning. She was smiling, and she told him that she felt that she was getting better and that she would soon be well. She didn't look well, though. She looked really frail and weak. Almira then continued, telling him that Nancy had come to her in a dream and that Nancy had told her not to worry, the pain would go away soon. Levi was very concerned about all of this, and he didn't like the sound of that dream. He'd already hired doctors to have a look at Almira, and they couldn't do anything. So Levi turned to what most people would have turned to in those circumstances: folklore and superstition. He met with the town elders to get permission to do what was needed to be done to drive out this evil spirit that was feeding on his family. He went with a small group of townsfolk and his family to the graveyard where his daughter lay. Levi exhumed the body, not willing to let anyone else help. He felt that he should be the only one that should shoulder the burden. Apparently the coffin was never opened. It was just placed straight on the fire to burn. The members of the family were advised to stand around the fire so that the vapours from the blaze may cleanse them of their evil consuming their household. They held hands and inhaled the smoke of her burning corpse. Not surprisingly, this cure didn't work, and within a year of the exhumation, Almira died of her illness. Within a few years, 4 more of the children died of consumption. Now, the majority of the people who were caught up in this vampire panic, they were usually working class folk, like farmers and labourers, and those who typically didn't have access to education. The next case is an example of an educated person who ended up as a victim of all the fear and the panic. Frederick Ransom, a Dartmouth College student from a well-respected, well-to-do family in South Woodstock, Vermont, died of tuberculosis on the 14th of February 1817 at the age of 20. Frederick's father had his body exhumed in the hopes of saving the rest of his family. His heart was removed and burned in a blacksmith's forge. Frederick's surviving brother Daniel wrote, quote, "However, it did not prove a remedy, for mother, sister, and 2 brothers died afterward." Another quote from him says, "It has been related to me that there was a tendency in our family to consumption, and that I would die with it before I was 30. Thankfully, when Daniel wrote this entry, he was more than 80 years old, so he was one of the lucky ones who was able to live a long and hopefully healthy life." The next family we're going to talk about lived in Jewett City, now a part of Griswold, Connecticut. Henry B. Ray and his wife Lucy had 5 children. On the 9th of March 1845, 24-year-old Lemuel, I hope I'm saying that right, Ray, died of consumption at the age of 24. A few years later, on the 3rd of July 1849, shortly before his 53rd birthday, his father, Henry B. Ray, died, and then his brother, Elisha, also passed away on the 1st of February 1851. In 1854, a third son, Henry Nelson, fell ill, and the family knew that they would have to do something if they wanted to stop this terrible disease spreading further. Once again, the family turned to folklore and myths, believing that the dead were draining the life out of the living members of the family. On the 8th of May 1854, a group of people, including the family, friends and various community members, exhumed the bodies of Lemuel and Elisha and burned them in the graveyard. The incident ended up making it into the newspapers, and the Ray family is known as the Jewett City Vampires. Unfortunately, the ritual didn't work, and Henry succumbed to the disease that same year, aged 34. And to add to his tragedy, his wife and children were also victims of the disease. The Ray family are all buried in Jewett City Cemetery. Now, there was an accidental discovery in the 1990s which suggested that maybe the Ray family weren't the Griswold region's first vampires. Whilst playing near a sand and gravel mine, some children accidentally unearthed 2 human skulls. At first, local authorities actually thought that the bones belonged to a victim of a local serial killer, but Connecticut state archaeologist Nicholas Bellantoni believed that the bones dated back much further. He investigated more and he did more digging, and he found a total of 29 unmarked graves in what was later identified as the Walton family cemetery that dated back to 1757. The skeletons found inside looked normal, but one grave stood out to him. Inside the coffin, which had JB55 spelled out in brass tacks, he found that the skeletal remains of a man had been rearranged. He had been dismembered. His skull had been severed from the spine and then placed face downward on the chest, which had been broken open. The 2 femur bones, the thigh bones, had then been arranged on the chest just below the skull in the shape of a cross. So skull and crossbones. This person, who is commonly known as JB, his bones had been mutilated roughly 5 years after he died. His coffin had also been smashed. His bones were analysed and showed that he had died of consumption and that JB was a man in his 50s. The JB55 on his coffin probably indicated his initials and his age when he died. 2 nearby bodies, those of a woman and a child, had also died from the disease. It is believed that JB's bones were rearranged in hopes of stopping him climbing out of the grave and feeding on the living family members. His family were all falling ill to consumption, and they must have believed that he was the undead, draining them of their life force. When JB was first discovered, his DNA was analysed, but the techniques weren't advanced enough to give much information. Now, a few years ago, researchers decided to take another look at JB55. Now, this is really interesting. The new study used, this is very long-winded, Y chromosomal DNA profiling and surname prediction based on genealogical data. Yeah, a bit of a mouthful, I know. And they linked JB55 to a farmer named John Barber. Now, there was an obituary from 1826 for a 12-year-old boy named Nicholas Barber, and it mentions his father, John Barber. A coffin with the same lettering spelled out with brass tacks was found close to JB 55's grave, and the inscription read NB13. Nicholas Barber, 12, 13 years old. So that's pretty solid evidence that they were father and son. The level of arthritis found in JB 55's bones also suggests that he was a farmer or a labourer. So after all this time, JB 55 was finally named, and I love that the world finally knows who he is. The last person I'm going to tell you about ended up being almost as famous as Lena Brown, but the case of Nelly Vaughn is a little different to the others and may actually be a case of mistaken identity. On the 31st of March 1889, Nellie Louise Vaughan died from pneumonia at the age of 19. Her body was buried at her family's farm. In October that same year, Nellie's mother was given permission to move Nellie's remains to a plot in a public cemetery, Plain Meeting House Cemetery at West Greenwich Baptist Church. There is no evidence to suggest that any of Nellie's family or friends believed that she was a vampire after she died. So, how did Nellie end up becoming known as one? It's popularly believed that high school students in the 1960s started this legend. So, the story goes, a teacher in Coventry, Rhode Island, told their students about the legend of Mercy Lena Brown, but the teacher didn't give any specifics. It said that they actually changed many details, either because they themselves didn't know the full story, or because they didn't want teenagers going around Rhode Island destroying old graveyards in the hunt for vampires. That didn't stop the teenagers though, and they asked more and more questions, and they eventually came to West Greenwich Baptist Church. They began searching the cemetery by the old wooden church, and in the darkness they came across Nelly Vaughan's grave. She had also died at the age of 19, the same age as Lena Brown. They then read the inscription on the tombstone, which read, quote, "I am watching and waiting for you." Okay, it's a little bit mysterious, yeah, but at the same time, that's, kind of a typical sweet little inscription that you'd find on a tombstone. But to the drunk students who were already inclined to believe these vampiric supernatural stories, they read the inscription as a threat. Nellie was laid in her grave, watching, waiting to strike out at unsuspecting victims. They had found another vampire. The gossip soon spread throughout the small town, and soon everyone was talking about Nelly Vaughn, the vampire. Their suspicions seemed to be confirmed when it was discovered that her body had been exhumed, even though it was for completely innocent reasons, when her mother was allowed to move her daughter's grave. And this rumour persisted for decades. People would say that grass and other plants wouldn't grow over her grave, and that the grave itself was sinking into the ground. Unfortunately, due to all the vampire rumours, and because people are just disrespectful, rude sods, the cemetery and church has suffered serious vandalism over the years. So, to preserve Nellie's grave, the tombstone has been removed from the site since the early 90s. Funnily enough, now that people aren't treading all over it, vegetation is growing again, and it's no longer sinking into the ground. Now, there has been some supernatural activity observed at the cemetery, but it's more of the ghostly kind. One person was approached by a young woman who looked to be wearing Victorian-style clothing, and this strange figure said, "I am happy." She then knelt down over one of the graves and started to sob. So the visitor asked this young woman if she needed any help, but again, she only replied with, "I am happy." The woman walked to her car, but when she looked back, this other young lady had vanished. A man who was visiting the cemetery noticed a young woman sitting on one of the tombstones. As he nodded to her, the young woman replied with, "I'm perfectly pleasant," and as he turned to her, she was gone. Another woman saw a young lady in a gown dancing among the graves. The next moment, she had disappeared. As the first woman went to leave, she saw the young lady dancing again in another part of the grave. Another visitor to the cemetery also saw a young woman sobbing, her hands covering her face. The visitor asked if the woman needed any help, and she said, "Why don't you see that I'm nice? I am happy." When asked where she was from, she pointed towards the gravestones, and then she was gone. It is said that on moonlit nights, a solitary young woman can be seen sitting on a tomb in the middle of the graveyard, whispering that she is not a monster, but that she is pleasant and happy. Some believe that because of all of the vampire confusion, the ghost of Nelly Vaughn is actually trying to clear her name. This is a rather unique case. Poor Nellie was confused for a vampire for no other reason than a seemingly strange inscription on her tombstone. And it's so interesting how decades after her death, this new rumour and legend came to life. You'd think that 70 years after her death, people wouldn't be so quick to believe in vampires, but apparently they are. I think if I was Nellie and accused of being a vampire, I'd probably take to haunting the cemetery in hopes of clearing my name. I'd probably be a bit more eager though. I'd be like, "Please, I'm not a vampire, I promise. I'm a ghost, but I'm not a vampire." The case of Mercy Lena Brown would be the last time the superstition of digging up the undead and burning their organs would be acted out. Mercy Lena Brown's grave exists still in Chestnut Hill Cemetery. She is buried there with other members of her family. Apparently, Lena's grave is reinforced with a metal band connected to a post which is embedded in the ground to stop people from trying to steal the grave. I can't believe that's even necessary. I mean, I can believe it. Like, look, no matter how interested you are in a case or a gravestone, leave it alone, okay? Let the dead rest in peace. Lena's grave is still popular to this day, and visitors sometimes leave little gifts and flowers and notes for her at her grave. Mercy Lena Brown's story may have had some sort of influence on a very well-known vampire novel, Dracula. In 1896, a newspaper clipping found its way into the papers of Bram Stoker, author of Dracula, which was published in 1897, and his theatre company was touring the US that same year. Some say that there wasn't enough time for the news to have influenced the Dracula script, but others see a connection between Mercy and Lucy, the teenage girl turned vampire, who was also exhumed in the book. And Lena and Mercy maybe inspired Lucy. Lena, Mercy, Lucy, perhaps. The story is even referenced in H.P. Lovecraft's The Shunned House. German scientist Robert Koch discovered the bacteria that caused tuberculosis in 1882. But it would take another 10 years for germ theory to catch on, and drug treatments wouldn't become available until the 1940s anyway. But people slowly started to understand that the bacteria was present in the spit of the infected person, and that coughs and sneezes could be deadly. Did you know? To this day, TB remains the world's most deadly infectious disease. It's still the leading cause of death from a single infectious agent. It's responsible for over 1 million deaths each year. It is curable, but it remains one of the top 10 causes of death worldwide. So, these are just a few of the many cases that earned Rhode Island the nickname of the Transylvania of North America. It's often awful what happened to Lena and all the others that suffered the same fate. They were dug up, not allowed to rest in peace. Their corpses were mutilated and parts of them were burned. Just because you're dead doesn't mean that you shouldn't be treated with respect. But as terrible as it was, it's not so black and white. I can understand why people would resort to doing something like that. These stories show you how desperation can grip a community and force them to commit actions that they probably never would. They were scared. Their parents, siblings, friends were all falling ill and dying, and it was spreading so quickly. They weren't acting normally. Life was hard back then. You can imagine the fear that the communities would have felt. Nothing was working, doctors couldn't stop it, so they turned to their traditions and folklores to help them out. And, we cannot talk. Do you remember a couple of years ago at the start of the pandemic when people were fighting each other for loo roll? Yeah. We haven't really changed much over the centuries, have we? Still very susceptible to fear. So thank you for hanging out with me today. I'm sorry for kind of all the stumbling over the words and kind of pronouncing some things wrong. My brain has, I think since COVID, my brain is a bit kind of fluffy. So yeah, I apologise. I didn't feel I was as, I don't know what the word is, smooth as I normally am. But I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and join me next time for another cup of terror.